Hello from Denver, Colorado. We are talking to you from the offices of the National Conference of State Legislatures, and we welcome you to today's webinar, ESSA, State Plan Database and Legislative Tracking Tool. My name is Dan Thatcher, and I will be moderating the webinar today. I'm a program director here at NCSL, where I work with and have the honor and privilege of working with Colleen Brooks, who's a senior policy specialist, and Ben Irwin, a research analyst. And these two individuals have worked very hard over the last year to compile all the information that we're going to be demonstrating today. And I'm very happy and proud of this work that they've done. And then I have been helpful on putting this together in a format that you can dig through. But we'll, of course, get into that in a moment. But first, some house cleaning. Over the next 60 minutes, we hope that you will participate, and that is through the chat box. So please feel free to chat your questions. And also below the chat box, you should see Resources tab. And from there, you can access a PDF of this presentation. And just to make sure the chat box is working and to make sure that you're out there, I'm hoping that you can each type in the state that you're in. And if you're feeling brave, I also encourage you to type in the maiden name of your mother's mother's maiden name, and where she was born. So my mother's maiden name is Granger. No, excuse me, it's Ryder. I forgot, it's Ryder, and she was born in Salt Lake City, Utah. So please go ahead and go for it. So to get started, I'm going to just go through a little bit of the purpose of why we have this tool in the first place. And this is, of course, a response to the passage of the Federal Elementary and Secondary Education Act reauthorization, the Every Student Succeeds Act, or as we'll be referring to it repeatedly, ESSA, in 2015. And after its passage, we were, of course, monitoring states' implementation of the Act. And part of the implementation is that each state had to submit to the U.S. Department of Education a consolidated plan that detailed how it intended to implement the federal law. And as these plans were approved by the Department of Education, we analyzed them, and by we, I mean Colleen and Ben, and we're able to develop a nice taxonomy of and categorize different elements of these approved state plans in a way that would make sense specifically for legislators and legislative staff. And by legislators and legislative staff, I mean state legislators and legislative staff. This is a tool that we built for you. And so we welcome your input as we dig into the tool. We want to make sure it's working for you, that you're getting the information you need and want out of this, and that it makes sense to you. So first we'll go through some of the technical aspects of the database and the legislative tracking tool. And as I say that, there's really three big components to the information we'll be sharing with you, and that is the database of the state plans. And it keeps track of all the individual components within each individual state and territorial state plan, or territorial plan, I guess. Actually, I've never really referred to it as a territorial plan, but anyway, I'm going to start doing that. And then there's the legislative tracking tool, which is meant to connect the legislation passed in the states and the territories that may or may not have some impact on the elements of the state plan. So we have throw a very broad net over this legislation, even if the legislation wasn't intending to specifically target an element of the ESSA state plan. We wanted to still capture it in the event that there was some unintentional consequence on the state plan from the passage of the legislation. Then the third component is a companion guide to the state plan database, which gives an overview of all the state plans and some of the most commonly seen elements that we've seen in the state plans. And again, I want to give props to Colleen, to Ben for putting this all together and doing the initial analysis and identifying trends across the states. They've done a phenomenal job of putting this all together. And on the back end, what I've been doing is trying to figure out a way that makes sense to dig into this information. So I've have this, what we are looking at right now. You should see a screenshot of the state plan database. And you can filter by state. You can select multiple states. And then you can also select by a few certain elements to the left, the filters to the left. And keep in mind, we are still building this out. This is our first iteration of it. We're going to be fine-tuning it, adding elements, and hopefully, and particularly out of the input and direction that you give us. So again, we have this screenshot of how you can dig through each individual state plan. This is built with a style that you can click on different components, and it's called an accordion in tech language, and it will open it up to more detailed information on each state plan. So we try to make it concise. If you're opening it up on your phone, on your computer, so you can see more information up front, and then you can click on different parts and dig deeper and deeper. And then also there's a link to the legislation and then the companion guide from here. The one last thing I'm going to mention before I pass the baton over to my colleague Colleen is that, again, these are analysis of the approved state plans. There is a waiver, there is a waiver process and also an amendment process. And as the states apply for waivers and get approvals, and as states apply for amendments and are approved, we will add those to this database and update it subsequently. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Colleen.
Perfect. Thanks, Dan. So we're going to walk through a few more slides with screenshots and information, and then we're going to transition into a live walkthrough to kind of demonstrate how you can use the database and all the cool features that Dan has built into the online database and the tracking tool. So hopefully that will be a helpful feature of the webinar. So as you may know from reviewing your own state's ESSA state plan, the state plans contain many provisions, and we've selected the provisions that seemed most relevant to our audience, like Dan mentioned, the state legislators and legislative staff, though they may be useful for other members of the public or other organizations as well. And then we've attempted to organize those provisions based on related content and subject matter or statutory organization. Other organizations have completed more holistic and comprehensive reviews of the state plans and then have perhaps assigned ratings based on those reviews, and that was not our intent. Ours was to provide a summary of the state plans, but not necessarily to rate them, and then really to provide a resource to you that outlines those provisions and allows you to review the high-impact content in a succinct manner that is also available and hyperlinked to the associated legislation. So we're really trying to draw the connection between what was put into the state plan and where the state action has happened or is happening. We do want to acknowledge, however, that much of the context that was built into the individual state plans is very helpful. And so it may be helpful to review the plans in a more holistic manner. So if you come across a provision as you're reviewing the database and you have more questions or something really doesn't make sense, all of those state plans are hyperlinked by clicking on the state flag, and you can review the entire approved version of the state plan. We just wanted to reinforce that context is important. And so we've just pulled out some of those pieces and tried to provide a more succinct version of that. So currently on your screen, you see that we have a screenshot of the database with Colorado's provisions, specifically those related to the annual meaningful differentiation. Under each section, you'll be able to click through on the arrows and read the state-specific provisions. And you will also have access to the associated legislation through a hyperlinked button, as well as the companion guide that Dan mentioned earlier. And again, we'll go through all of that when we are walking through the live walkthrough a few different state examples. And so for the online companion guide, it is meant to provide a baseline reference for understanding of each of the plan's provisions. Here you'll find information that refers to the statutory definition or the guidance provided by the U.S. Department of Education for each plan provision included in the database. You'll also find links to additional external resources and guiding questions that may provide support as you review your different plan provisions. We've also included mapping features for certain provisions that will be linked back to the database and filter the results based on the criteria in the map legend. And we have a few of those to show you as well when we walk through this on the live version. Finally, each of the provisions in the database will have a link that you may click on so that if at any time you need to refresh your memory on the specific plan provision, you can access that content. All right.
Now we'll go over how to access relevant legislation. So when tracking legislation, we identified a wide variety of categories to ensure that we encompass all aligned or relevant legislation. In this way, we hope to shed light on legislative efforts as they relate to state education agency initiatives and priorities included in the ESSA plan. Categories include accountability system, assessment, disproportionate access, school improvement, and SEA technical assistance, in addition to more specific tags such as school quality and student success indicator and test participation. The tool also allows users to search by bill location and status, which helps to weed through proposed and enacted legislation. We are in the process of updating the tracker with legislation from the 2019 session, and users will be able to sift through bills progressing through their respective state houses. Finally, the legislative tracking tool can focus searches by state in order to get a snapshot of action in a single state or compare states with one another. For example, when paired with the categorical tags, a user could compare legislative initiatives in Tennessee to address disproportionate access to effective educators in rural communities with similar initiatives in Colorado. We will demo the use of the different features of the legislative tracking tool shortly.
They'll tell you how to access this database, and it will be in the, of course, in the presentation that we're sending out, but the link to get to the homepage is www.ccrslegislation.info. Again, that's www.ccrslegislation.info. Alternatively, you can get to the same information by typing in www.ncsl.org/CCRS legislation. This is what you should be seeing here is the database for the individual state plans. And I'm just going to do a quick walkthrough of what you can do in this database and how it just kind of functionally works. So again, as mentioned, there are some filters, and you can filter by state, and I'll filter by my home state, Utah. And when you get there, you can filter by N size if you want. But to get to the individual elements of the Utah State Plan, click on the View Plan Summary, and it will do a drop-down of all the individual components as we've categorized them. Establishment of long-term goals, annual meaningful differentiation, annual measurement of achievement, continued support for school and LEA improvement, identification of the schools, student support and enrichment grants, supporting effective instruction. And by just clicking on one of these elements, for example, more rigorous intervention, you can read what Utah has proposed in its state plan. And if you want to learn more about what more rigorous intervention is about, then you can click on the Learn More button. And this will, again we'll do another demonstration of how this works with some specific examples in a moment. However, the other thing I want to quickly demonstrate is the legislative database. And multiple ways to get there. Here's one. And again, here, there are multiple filters that can be used. And just to, by way of a quick demonstration, because this can be a little tricky for first-time users, there's, as you see, a legislative category up here on the right. You can select any of those. Current disposition refers to where the bill is in the legislative process. So, for example, whether it's filed, pending, enacted. Bill location refers to where it is in terms of whether it's introduced in first committee, first chamber, second chamber, et cetera. You can also filter by the date it was introduced or the date of last action. You can also do a keyword search. Over here on the left, you'll see the number of bills that meet your filtered criteria. And then the pie chart to the right shows the disposition of those bills that you've filtered for. And the green would be enacted, blue pending, red is failed. And then, of course, we have the state map, and you can even click on the state map to select the state. So I just clicked on California, and to the right of California, you can see how many, what percentage of the bills, according to the filters, were introduced by Democrats, Republican, or by committee. And then, of course, there's the big graph bar chart, underneath, which shows the disposition of all the bills that we're looking at. And then we have these cards to the bottom right that you can click on to access even more information about the individual bills that fit the criteria. And I'm going to leave it at that for right now because we're going to do a live walkthrough with some very specific examples of how this works out in practice.
All right, thanks, Dan. So to demonstrate how to use the database, companion guide, and legislative tracking tool, we thought it would be best to walk through a few state-specific examples to show how each component interacts with one another. Almost there. All right. Perfect. All right, and so we're going to start by looking at Colorado's state plan, and then I'm going to jump over from there into some of the other features. And I'm going to try to scroll slowly, so I apologize if I make you dizzy. I'm attempting to be as user-friendly here as possible. Again, we're in the state plan database, and we're going to look at Colorado's plan summary. And for this example, we are going to look at Colorado's landscape by looking at the supporting effective educators elements, which is towards the bottom. And for the specific provision that we want to look at, we are going to focus on the disproportionate access to effective educators tab. And so perhaps you need to refresh your memory on what the state plan actually required for this provision. That is where you can click on this Learn More hyperlink to see a bit more specificity around what the law required or what the U.S. Department of Education required when approving the state plans. And so here we're now jumping into the companion guide to review what the disproportionate access provision means. And here we are. And so I can click on the plus sign to the right. And you'll see that the companion guide reminds me that the states were required to address how low-income and minority children enrolled in schools served by Title I Part A funds are not served at disproportionate rates by ineffective, out-of-field, or inexperienced teachers. So this just kind of sets that foundation for what was required in the state plan. Right, and so now I'm going to jump back into the Colorado provisions. So we're back in Colorado, and I want to find out what exactly Colorado committed to for this provision. And you'll see that they've outlined a commitment to eliminating differences in rates for students being taught by ineffective and inexperienced teachers by 2026. It's worth noting that this timeline is Colorado specific and that states have outlined their own expectations in each plan. Many of the states relied on the content within their equity plans that were submitted prior to the passage of ESSA, but noted that they intended to submit amendments once additional data that meets the ESSA definitions was available. If you are savvy with this specific provision, one of the definitions was a bit new under ESSA, and so some states needed to take the time to outline what that definition meant for their state and then ensure that they had the correct mechanisms in place to collect that data. So they are either currently updating their plan and collecting that data so that they can, or I know a few states have already looked into submitting those amendments. We'll be sure to include those updates once the states have received approval of the amended state plans. So now I'll let Ben walk you through how to access the associated legislation that's relevant to these specific provisions in Colorado.
Thank you, Colleen. So after seeing the goals set by the state to increase access to effective educators in the state plan, we can utilize the legislative tracking tool to see what the state legislature is doing to address the same issue. First, we'll scroll to the Access State Legislation link. We will access the full screen dashboard of the legislative tracking tool. Then we will give it a moment to load. Then we will select the state. We can select the state using the drop-down menu or just by clicking on the state on the map itself, and relevant tags. So although reducing the rate of students being taught by ineffective and inexperienced educators most directly applies to the disproportionate access tag here. Selecting multiple tags, including quality effective instruction, can provide a fuller picture of the legislative landscape on teaching issues. It really depends on the desired breadth of your search. So for this case, we will select the disproportionate access tag and quality effective instruction. Oh, it looks like we will need to reselect Colorado. So you'll see that 10 bills or resolutions were introduced, 9 of which were enacted or adopted. Then you're able to scroll through the bill results for more information. When you select a bill, you will get a brief summary generated by StateNet, a link to the bill text, and a link back to the state plan. For this example, we will select the bill text, which includes track changes to statute. With House Bill 1412, we see that the Colorado legislature enacted a grant program to fund initiatives to retain teachers. Forgive me for the technical difficulty here for a moment. So when we select House Bill 1412, we'll scroll down to the bill text. And you'll see that the Colorado legislature enacted a grant program to fund various allowable retention initiatives in districts with teacher shortages, including job sharing and co-teaching programs, induction, mentoring, financial incentives, increased planning and collaboration time, as well as professional development opportunities. And this bill really is a good example of the ways in which you can see where there's alignment. It is our hope that state legislators and other policymakers can utilize this tool to inform state education agency and legislative action where policy goals will overlap. I will hand it over to Colleen to provide us with another example.
All right, so we are going to jump back into the database. And this time we're going to take a look at Georgia's state plan.
We're just refreshing the page real quick to make sure the current information is available.
All right. And so we'll scroll down and find Georgia. Here we go. And we'll select View Their Plan Summary. And this time we're going to specifically focus in on continued supports for LEAs, or for school and LEA improvement. And so you'll see that we have a few different options there. Under the continued supports, we have provisions related to more rigorous intervention, the supports for those schools that have been identified for more rigorous intervention, as well as supports for schools identified for comprehensive support, targeted support, and additional targeted support, and as well as the State Education Agency technical assistance. So we tried to group here not necessarily just by the statutory provisions, but really by the supports that are outlined in the plan for those schools identified for improvement. As a reminder, the CSTS and ATS schools, as you'll see them referenced throughout the database, are the initial identifications outlined under the ESSA accountability system of meaningful differentiation. So we'll discuss a few of the components of how those identifications are made in the next example, but in this case we're going to focus on the supports Georgia outlined in their state plan for schools that have been identified for comprehensive or targeted support and improvement. So I will select that third tab under the continued supports. So this is one of the more explicit connections between a state plan provision and state legislative action. Here you'll see that Georgia specifically outlined and referred to the statute that establishes the Chief Turnaround Officer, as well as other supports for the identified school. Then I'll let Ben walk you through this bill in a bit more detail with our legislative tracking tool.
So we will again scroll down to the Access State Legislation link. Give it a moment for the full screen dashboard to load. Again, this example yields itself to using multiple tags. Since school improvement is such a broad topic, we can select school improvement. We can select SEA technical assistance, student services, and more rigorous intervention. So then we will focus on Georgia. And that narrows the results to 8 bills or resolutions. As Colleen referenced in the plan summary, Georgia's ESSA plan references state statute establishing the Chief Turnaround Officer and an Office for School Turnaround to support the lowest performing schools. So as we scan proposed and enacted legislation, we see that House Bill 338 is a bill related to the low-performing schools in need of assistance. From the 2017 legislative session, and it references a system of supports for the lowest performing schools. A closer look at House Bill 338 reveals that the legislation provides the foundation for Georgia's school improvement efforts in the ESSA state plan. The bill establishes the Office for School Turnaround and the position of the Chief Turnaround Officer. The legislation not only outlines supports for the lowest performing schools, but also outlines eligibility and procedural requirements for identified schools to enter into a contractual agreement outlining interventions and supports with the Chief Turnaround Officer and Office for School Turnaround. The legislation also lays the groundwork for more rigorous interventions, which are triggered after 3 years of identification as a comprehensive support school. Authority over more rigorous interventions is delegated to the Chief Turnaround Officer in the intervention contract, which is outlined in state statute and in the state ESSA plan. House Bill 338 is a unique example of alignment between SEAs and the legislature in terms of state ESSA plans, reinforcing that a unified vision can help to ensure more impactful school improvement efforts.
All right, so we're about halfway through our live walkthrough. We have 2 more examples that we'd like to go through, and so I'm going to go back into the database. All right, and this time we're going to take a look at Tennessee. And I believe I need to go to the second screen. All right. So now we're going to review the system of identifying schools for improvement and one of the indicators that's used in that identification process. The School Quality or Student Success Indicator was newly minted under ESSA and provided states with an opportunity to infuse state priorities into the accountability framework. There was a lot of excitement and media attention around this specific indicator. And so if I scroll down and look at the SQSS indicator, you'll see that we have it broken down for both elementary and middle and high schools. And just to kind of show you some of the more other features in the companion guide, I'm going to click through. And so this hops over to the companion guide. Oh, and so it provides us with that definition of what was required for the SQSS indicator. States were given the option to select or include multiple indicators within this, but statute required that they apply them consistently to the all-student group and each subgroup of students. Most states' indicators look different in some capacity, whether in subject matter or in weighting. Some states chose to focus on one topic for their SQSS indicator, and I think some states had upwards of 6 to 8 different subtopics that they were trying to address within this one indicator. All right, and so then if I hop back into the state plan, we are going to compare. We're going to first look at Tennessee, and then we'll compare that to Texas, see just how different the 2 states' approaches were here. Right. So you notice that in Tennessee's plan, they focused in both the elementary and middle school and high school levels on chronic absenteeism. But note, however, that the high school also has a measure of a Ready Graduate indicator that reflects college, career, and workforce readiness. And so even just within the state, they elected at the different levels of the schools to focus on different topics within those indicators. So now if I scroll down, we're going to look at Texas to compare the 2 states and see how Texas defined this for their own state. Unlike Tennessee, Texas did not rely on a measure of attendance or absenteeism, but rather chose to include a measure of achievement on the state STAR assessment for elementary and middle schools, and a college, career, and military readiness indicator for high schools. While this indicator provides states with the ability to tailor the system to their own needs, it is important to note that this also results in a different methodology of identifying schools for improvement state to state. So the framework that Tennessee used to identify schools for improvement within Tennessee is going to look much different than what it looks like in Texas, just based on this one indicator by itself. And there are a varying number of reasons that ESSA gave states that flexibility, but that's part of the outcome, is that states were able to prioritize different topics in their framework. All right, so it's also important to note on this one indicator that many of the states indicated that data was unavailable for the content of the indicator that they had hoped to include. Many states received feedback that their stakeholders wanted one topic to be included within their accountability framework. However, they didn't have the data available to do so, so they committed to amending and updating this provision in the future when they were able to obtain that data. So we'll be sure to update our database with the amended plans once they've been approved to reflect those updates. All right, so jumping back into the Tennessee example now, I'm going to let Ben walk you through the associated legislation that relates to the SQSS indicator.
We will scroll back to the Access State legislation link. And for this selection, I will give the dashboard a moment to load. For this selection, we will just use the SQSS tag, since this will include legislation related to chronic absenteeism. While tracking legislation relevant to the school quality and student success indicator, we only tag legislation aligned with the SQSS indicator specific to the state plan. In this case, we tracked attendance in college and career readiness legislation for Tennessee, while in Texas we would focus on bills addressing the STAR assessment. We'll go to Tennessee and scroll through the legislation. We're going to take a look at House Bill 2376. As you can see, the legislative summary provided by StateNet indicates that the bill addresses exclusionary discipline alternatives. Although this is one piece of the legislation, there are also key provisions regarding student attendance. House Bill 2376 facilitates the enforcement of compulsory attendance laws by increasing the frequency of reporting requirements, establishing an LEA attendance supervisor position to oversee reporting, and the development of truancy intervention plans. Although it is not explicitly stated, the legislation has the desired effect of reducing chronic absenteeism rates, which would improve school performance within the Tennessee accountability framework under ESSA. So I'll hand it back over to Colleen for our final example.
All right. So for our last example, during this live walkthrough, we're going to focus on the establishment of long-term goals, specifically the provision regarding high school graduation, and we're going to look at the state of Washington. All right, so here we're going to open the long-term goal for graduation and once again refresh our memory on what was required for the long-term goal under the state plan. So this jumps us over into the companion guide, and I can click on the graduation tab. You'll notice that the companion guide outlines that ESSA required states to describe their long-term goals for students to attain graduation requirements as measured by the 4-year adjusted cohort rate. And then states were also given the option to outline extended year graduation goals, but were not required to do so. In the actual state plan database, you'll see that we tried to note where states took the option of that, the latter of those two. So here you'll also see in the companion guide one of the mapping features. We've taken the information provided in the state plans and mapped out the different timelines provided by the states. And so we don't have this for every provision within the state plan, but for a handful of them, we thought it was helpful to have a visual tool and to see kind of how the plans varied across the states. I'm going to jump back into the Washington State Plan now, and we are going to compare Washington and the provisions in their plan with the West Virginia plan. Right. So again, I'm in Washington looking at the graduation. So Washington outlined a goal of all students and subgroups reaching a 4-year adjusted rate of 90% by June of 2027. You'll notice the timeline is at the bottom there. And so if I jump down and look at West Virginia and the content in their state plan, they have set a much different timeline and goal. Their adjusted goal for all students and subgroups is 95%, and they have outlined a timeline of 2030. All right, so now I'll let Ben walk you through a bill that, while not explicitly addressing the high school graduation rates in Washington, is related, and it provides a great example of how you can use the database and legislative tools together to understand all the work that's going on in a state.
We will again go to the full screen dashboard of the legislative tracking tool. And this is another case where you would likely want to select more than one tag just to ensure that you're getting all of the results that you're looking for. So in this case, we would select high school graduation rates and high school graduation requirements. And then we would focus it down to Washington. And we'll see that there are 13 bills or resolutions. For this example, we're going to look specifically at House Bill 1600, which provides funding for the creation of a work integrated learning initiative for students interested in career pathways. Under this bill, local applicant schools receive funding through participation in the initiative, and in exchange for that funding, they must provide academic curricula in a work integrated and career contextualized manner and include an external mentor for each student in the program. Local applicant schools selected to participate in the Work Integrated Learning Initiative must submit to the Work Integrated Learning Advisory Committee the end of project report that includes numeric and other data summarizing the effects of their work integrated program, including high school graduation rates, state test scores, and community partnerships, including partnerships with local employers and industries. By implementing a career-focused initiative, schools are able to engage students in relevant content and connect them with mentorship opportunities, making students more likely to finish the program and graduate from high school. By offering various graduation pathways, this initiative supports reaching the long-term goal of a 90% statewide graduation rate by 2027. We wish to highlight this bill in order to show the ways in which legislation can align or overlap with state ESSA plans and vice versa. We hope this tool can be used to maximize the impact of legislative and SEA initiatives and programs. Now I will hand it over to Dan for closing remarks and questions.
Thank you very much, Ben and Colleen, for that in-depth and very interesting demonstration of how these tools work in collaboration with you. If there are questions, please ask them now, either through the chat box or we can open it up on the phone. No, just through the chat box, yeah. And I'll give about a minute in case there are questions. While we're waiting, if there's any questions coming in, I want to again reiterate that we will be updating these tools on an ongoing basis and fleshing them out with further information and analyses. So please come back often and see what information might be new there. Also, please feel free to reach out to any one of us with questions, and we can either give you another tutorial on how this works. We're here to help, and I hope that you can use this in a way that will support your work. I don't think that we have any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and direct you to our information here. These links that will have our names will be linked to our email addresses. And again, the link at the bottom here is to the web page that has an overview of all the different tools available. Finally, the recording of this webinar will be posted online very soon, and you can refer back to it and refer your friends and family to it too. And thank you for joining us, and I hope that everyone on the line on the interweb has a wonderful afternoon.